All right. Well, I always wait the few initial seconds there just to make sure this thing's going up. There might be a problem here on this one. I noticed a little glitch just as I started, but we'll go ahead and do it anyway. Yeah. Well, today's the 27th of April, 2021. I'm Roy Potter. Welcome to all of you who are about ready to come in or have come in. I don't see anybody yet, but I'm going to go ahead and throw this up because I've been getting some interesting questions. Hello, everyone. I've been getting some interesting questions both on the YouTube site and on Twitter, and also just generally from people that know me and watch this, and I see them from time to time. So the title of this one ought to get a few people's attention, I imagine. And we're not going to go into a whole lot of depth, but I figured it was necessary for me to at least carry on with some of the explanations. I've already covered some of the material I'm going to cover today. We've talked about the thing with the virgin idea that it meant that you haven't had the woman has not born a firstborn child. That's the real issue of virginity in Hebrew, not the fact that the other idea of a perpetual virginity. But I'll get to that in a minute because there's something right in Matthew that really gives a really good indication of what's going on there. Okay, and again, these are subjects that aren't for the faint-hearted, for the weak-minded, or for those whose faith is so tender and so shaky that they can't handle this type of thing. And I don't expect you to come here. You can go and take your time elsewhere. But this is for those who would like to talk about these particular issues because they do influence what we do today. Everything that happened in the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago affects us even today, and I've talked about that before. Okay, the first thing I want to do is I've talked about the different books that I use, and I have to admit that the books that I use are uh, pretty sophisticated. Okay, and I've suggested some of those to you, and maybe that was wrong for me to suggest those upscale type books. Hello, Ms. Cat. Thank you for being here. But the reason why I did it is because, in my estimation, with all the study that I've done, I figure that these particular individuals that have done these studies are closest to the truth because they really don't have any axes to grind or any sacred cows to protect. Uh, and that's really the reason why. But even within their works, there are some easier books, which I might discuss in a minute. But I want to show you one more time what we're doing here, okay? I started off telling you about Dr. Eisenman's books, and I had this one handy, and you already know about this. There are some people that have already gotten this book here, and it's a good book, but it's thick, okay? And they run around $30 or so, something like that new. It's a hardbound one, this one is. And it's very in depth. It covers the subject totally in depth, and it can get laborious, but you won't be left asking any questions of yourself, thinking, well, did he cover this subject? Because he's going to cover it. So there's this book here. Some of you already got it. And then I mentioned that it might be actually better for you to get this book here. This is the one I've been talking about, James, the brother of Jesus. Okay, this one right here. And again, it's by Robert Eisenman. And it's not a light read either. But the second book there, the one I first showed you, the New Testament Code, is basically the information that was not included in this book, is basically what it is. So that's the reason why I say if you get that book, you might be going, what's going on here? How come I'm coming in like in the middle of a conversation? Well, this is the reason why. So this is why I say that it's probably best to get this book first. If you all are serious about this study, if you're serious about the study, this is where you want to be. Thank you for taking care of my room, Mrs. Cat. This is James, the brother of Jesus, and it says the key to unlocking the secrets of early Christianity and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, you can see that right there. But let me show you something. That's how thick that book is. It's 1,160 something pages, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 1,160 pages. It's not an easy read. The other one, if you get into it, it's like I said, the information he gives you in this one will, if you start on that other book first, you'll kind of be wondering what's going on. So that's why I'm again advising you to get this. Now he has some other books. There's uh, uh, James, the brother of Jesus, and the early Christians, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the early Christians. You can look on Amazon under Robert Eisenman, his books, and you'll see a whole bunch of them. All of them are good. Uh, you'll get some with actual translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls. For instance, there's the Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered, which has about 50 of the earlier documents that they found in Cave One. Uh, I don't study all of those. Okay, I have four or five that I really concentrate on because there's obvious correlations to the first century, and those are the community rule, the Damascus document, MMT, um, the War Scroll, and I guess that's it. A lot of people bring up the Copper Scroll, but the Copper Scroll is really just where the treasure of the temple was buried, where it was hidden. And unfortunately, the Romans apparently already got that, so you're not going to be able to use the Copper Scroll to go find it. Okay, but the reason why I use about four or five of the scrolls, I don't use them all, because my period of interest, where I'm really concerned, goes from right around 10 BC up to and including the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and thereabouts. So that's the reason why I stick with the ones I just explained to you. Uh, and you'll see why as we go through this more in the future. I've already alluded to some of those things, like how they refer to the Herodians and not the Maccabees, how they refer to the Romans and not anybody else like the Greeks or anybody like that. But you're going to get into some really heavy stuff if you get this book. Uh, but the reason why I say it's best to start here is because if you start in on the second book, as I've said, you're going to be wondering, well, I must have missed something. That's because he builds in that second book on what he says here. Okay. All right. Let me bring you one more thing here that's absolutely necessary. There are lots of well, there aren't a lot of historians in the first century. You can go to the Roman historians, Suetonius, people like that, but they're talking about basically the Romans themselves, what they were doing in Rome, and generally what they were doing throughout the empire, the intrigues in the emperor's court, things like that. Uh, Basic administrations in Rome and things like that. But I don't concentrate on that because it really doesn't have that much to do with my interest in what's happening in Palestine, and so that's why I stick primarily with Josephus. And this book here is thick. Let's see, it's got 1,140 pages. Okay, heavy reading too, but it's pretty good. Josephus, on my book, it was kind of funny because on the Crimson Thread, when Robert Eisenman, the professor that wrote those other books, uh, when he reviewed my book, he said, "Well, you know, uh, unfortunately, most of the things in the first century are fictionalized romance, except for Josephus." And then in parentheses, he put, and sometimes even Josephus. But he said that because they're fictionalized romance, and that's what kind of messed the whole thing up in the first place. He says of my book, he says, so it's good for Roy Potter to use fictionalized romance using the precision of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the historians of the time. But this isn't the only historian. You've also got, like, and I've mentioned a few of these. Uh, as a matter of fact, even Josephus mentions a few of them. You've got Pliny, you've got Philo, you've got Eusebius, who is actually a few centuries down, but he's pretty close. Irenaeus, Hegesippus, um, Herodotus. Anyway, there are a few of those like that you can use also, but you're not going to be able to find those probably in books. You're probably going to have to get their information on the internet. One of the interesting ones is Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr, he got his name Martyr because he was beheaded because of what he was doing. But Justin Martyr is probably one of the more early, I guess you could almost say, eyewitnesses. Not quite, but almost. Paul is really the earliest eyewitness that we have, actually, and he was even after the events. But And some of his stuff is historical, and some of it is fictionalized romance, as I said just a few minutes ago. But uh, Justin Martyr is a good one also to read. But he's definitely coming not from an historical perspective. So just keep that in mind. And it's not very long. Justin Martyr's thing is maybe I don't know, 30 pages long, something like that. If you read it on the internet, something like that. But and basically, what it is, if you all are familiar with Justin, he's making an appeal to Caesar for and in behalf of the Christians, that they're not the problem. See, the Romans were identifying the Christians, and rightly so in this period, as the same ones who were doing the revolts in Rome. Over the historical rewrite, people have tried to remove those early so-called Christians, which even at this point in time they were not. That Justin Martyr's talking about, that they just started to call them that actually. Uh, they tried to remove those people from political activity. And nothing could be further from the truth. They were very much involved in political activity. And as you read these things, especially Josephus, you'll understand that. So a lot of the early martyrs that we think were just out there teaching the Beatitudes to the Romans, that wasn't it. Okay. Some of them probably did venture from the Palestine, some of the Sicarii that I've talked about, some of the Messianists, some of the Nazarites who were fighting Rome, were doing things around the empire, trying to disrupt Roman operations. And so, because of that, anybody who claimed that anybody but the emperor had authority was considered to be an insurrectionist. So, if you say that you're a Christ follower, well, they're going to assume, and unfortunately, history has tried to paint this over. Unfortunately, most of the time, they were involved in political insurrection. That was what the whole thing was about in the first place. And you get that from my book. You kind of understand that information. It didn't become Paulinized until around 50 AD is kind of when it started. When I say Paulinized, I mean, the turn the other cheek, pacifist, all support the Roman authorities, pay your taxes, Romans 13 type stuff. That was all Pauliny. That was all Paul. That had nothing to do with the original movement that Jesus and James and John and Peter and all of them were actually started. And you understand that when you read this. And you've got the wars of the Jews and you've got the antiquities of the Jews. And it's a very small area in the wars of the Jews. It's not very long. Antiquities, it's a little longer. But you'll get that information here. And Josephus is good for just basic information anyway. But a lot of tongue-in-cheek stuff here. As I said, the Testimonium Flavianum, which people cite all the time as being evidence that Josephus knew about Jesus, it's definitely out of context. And when you see that, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Plus, as I mentioned, he called Vespasian, the emperor of Rome, the Messiah who would come out of Judea. And so, if he had then later called out that Jesus was the Messiah, he was playing with his life. He was playing with his head. So I thought I'd just bring those books so you can kind of get an idea. There are simpler books to get into, but those are what I study. I've studied a lot there. I've studied Vermes, for instance, Giza Vermes, who is one of the first to get involved with the scrolls, and there are a lot of others. But I've stuck basically with Eisenman primarily because even though people think that he has an axe to grind, out of all of them that I've looked at, he's the one that has the least number of axes to grind. His deal was to get the Dead Sea Scrolls out to you, as I've said before. Okay? All right. Let's move on. I just wanted to show you those books so you know what I have a little bit of there when I'm talking about the books. Let's talk a little bit about some garbling of names that causes so much difficulty in the New Testament more than anywhere else. There are a lot of Jameses. There's a number of Marys, a number of Josephs. A real problem one is Judases. There are a bunch of Judases. And it's hard to keep track of who's talking about who, when, where, how, and why. In Josephus, for instance, he does talk about Judas Sepphoris, Judas the Galilean, Judas the Sicarii, leader of the Sicarii. all sorts of Judas the Galilean, for instance. All of these Judases. Now, a repetition of names isn't necessarily indicative of something trying to be obscured, but you have to at least take it into consideration when you're studying history. You have to at least do that. And then you have the other problem of changing from one language to another. And I'm going to give you an example of that here. What is Josephus's Jewish name? Does anybody know what Josephus, his Jewish name was? I'll just tell you. Yosef ben Metatyahu. Metatyahu. Metatyahu is what you would know as Matthew. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? We've already talked about Paul. Paul, who was originally Saul of Tarsus, and the time period of Saul and Costobarus is still in the basically the same time period. And just like Paul says he has ties to the house of King Agrippa, so does Saul of Tarsus. Okay, we're likely talking about the same person here. A lot of people will say it isn't, because if they admit that, then they have to admit that Paul was up to something else that people don't want to admit. But the fact of the matter is, even when you read Josephus and then you tie in the information that's in the New Testament, as I did a couple of videos ago on when Paul escaped from the temple and the Romans took him to Agrippa's castle, and then on to Rome. That shows all of his ties. So that's just another example. But anyway, let's get back to Josephus. Remember, I'm not saying this is a fact, but I'm saying it played a part in the development of the Gospels in particular. And whether we want to admit it or not, we have to look at it. If you're going to do this, from an historical perspective, you have to look at it at least in a very, at least a casual way, and I would suggest do it in a very deep and studied way. But let's talk about it again. How many Josephs are there in the New Testament? A number. Joseph of Arimathea, Joseph the husband of Mary, who that's an overwrite. That's not actually the case, as I point out in my book, and for the reasons that I point out. But let's just go ahead and talk about this. You've got Yosef ben Metatyahu. So he has two names there that show up in the New Testament, Joseph and Matthew. Interesting. Paul talks about, of course, being, there's Matthew there and these other people that were associated with, but they kind of disappear. They're mentioned one time and then you don't see them again. All right? That happens to a number of the apostles. James, for instance, the biggest thing that happened in 62 CE, 62 AD in Palestine was the stoning and martyrdom of James. Acts doesn't even mention it. Why? Well, it did, but it's hidden in some other storytelling, and so you miss it. That happens all the time because, again, there was this problem with the Roman authorities kind of making a check on everything. And I know a lot of people are saying, man, you're jumping to a lot of conclusions. All you got to do is give Eisenman a chance. Okay? That's all I'm saying. Give Eisenman a chance. Other scholars will talk about these things, but they have institutions to protect. They have sacred cows to, put up on altars, things like that. Eisenman doesn't have that. Okay, another name that's kind of interesting. By the way, Josephus's Roman name, once he switched sides, the traitor, and went with the Romans and was basically taken into the imperial Flavian family. His name was changed to Titus Flavius Josephus. Now, Paul talks about being with somebody by the name of Timothy in the New Testament, right? You have 1st and 2nd Timothy, right? Epistles to 1st and 2nd Timothy. You have Titus in the New Testament. There's some indications that Josephus knew Paul because Josephus was brought into the Herodian inner circle. Okay? That was later on. That was during war. But he was the general in Galilee, in charge of the Jewish general, in charge of the operations in Galilee. Almost certainly, he would have run into Paul in the 50s, if not earlier. So let's look at this. Let's look at the name of Titus as opposed to Timothy. Is that the same person? Could it be? I'm not saying it is, but again, these are historical overlaps that we have to examine in our study of the New Testament. The name of Titus is Latin. Okay, that's the Latin name, Titus. Does anybody here know what the Greek name for Titus is? Does anybody know? Take a wild guess. I kind of gave you a hint just a few minutes ago. The Latin name is Titus. The same name in Greek is Timothy. Did you just hear what I said? Just explained that Paul and Josephus probably ran into each other, if not during the 50s, possibly during the war. Okay, especially when Josephus went back to Rome and was writing his chronicles there, if you want to call that. Paul was probably, and I've made that, and it's just a theory, but Paul was still hanging around. I doubt very seriously whether he was a big part of the way that they won the war in Palestine against the Jews, and so it's very, very possible that Josephus and Paul knew each other at least at some point, from some before Paul was executed, or to shut him up. By the way, Josephus was probably executed by Domitian, the Emperor Domitian, for the same reason. He knew too much. Okay, these emperors are very concerned about people finding out about their operations, about how they hold on to power. And Domitian had, most likely, there's no actual evidence of it, but it's most likely that Domitian at least exiled Josephus at some point, or took him out. When I say exiled, again, it's like what they probably did with Epstein, right? Change his name, send him off with a lifetime of goodies, to some island somewhere. Or in the case of as I talked about with John the Revelator the other night, exiled somewhere to shut him up. So they'll either pay him off and send him somewhere, exile him, or execute them to protect their power. So again, just to kind of wrap all that up, it's very possible, not unlikely, that Josephus and Paul worked with each other on this whole deal, with names like I just gave you, Yosef ben Mattityahu, right? You have Joseph, and you have Matthew, then you have Titus and Timothy, all these things that kind of jive together. So I wanted to talk about that and let you know that those are historically some things we have to look at. A lot of people have the same kind of names, but under the circumstances as we see these things recurring in the events of the historical period that we're talking about, I think they're more than coincidences, and I think that that's another reason why we have so many problems with understanding what was really going on in the first century, and particularly around the events of the New Testament. All right, and I will take a few questions here. I did a little information with you all about the Virgin Mary, some videos back, and again, not to step on anybody's understandings or spiritual beliefs, faith, or whatever, but for those who want to, look at the thing, this entire situation, from another angle, because you're trying to figure it out, I think that's legitimate, okay? And some people say I'm just trying to mess up Christianity, but I'm really not. I want the true Christianity to come out. That's what I want. And it's more than the Beatitudes. Okay, the historical situation is much more rich and deserving of attention than that. We can't let the Romans deflect, and the current Romans as well. Your political leaders in D.C., political leaders in London, political leaders in Berlin, wherever. They're all up to the same thing. It's all the same thing over and over again. And that's why if you ignore what happened in the first century and just take it as only a faith-based thing, you're going to miss the real lesson. They didn't crucify Jesus for teaching the Beatitudes, as I said so many times. Well, the whole thing on virginity is the same thing. Remember, I told you about the Vestal Virgins in Rome. You know, there was a reason why they made them Jesus's mother a Vestal Virgin, which is essentially what it is. Okay, to carry on the Roman idea of the perpetual virginity of the goddess. And if a Vestal Virgin stepped out of line and performed the little deed outside the temple, she was executed. Okay? So, what does it have to do with? It has to do with the same thing that kings would do when they would castrate the servants, the male servants in the king's court. They're called eunuchs. They would do that so that the eunuchs couldn't impregnate the royal women. I don't like that idea. I think it's a terrible thing, but that's the case. Now, in Judaism, the Romans considered circumcision to be becoming a eunuch. It really wasn't. It was just the real purpose, of course, was to narrow the availability of the encounters, so to speak, and that you know what the genealogy is. It has to do with the birthright again and all of that. So the circumcision was not just about sexual purity. That's not what it was about. To some extent, but it was more to identify cross lineages, okay? To keep that from happening, and to not abuse it, of course. But now it's developed. This whole idea of sexuality is developed into total abstinence, or I don't want to get too deep into this, but when you study at least the way that it worked in the Torah and in the Tanakh as well, there were a lot larger parameters than what you're led to believe by those who want to control you in your private life. Okay, I'll just put it that way. But let's get back to the Virgin Mary. I want you to go to Matthew chapter 1, 25. And there's been this big question about, remember, it talks about the brothers of Jesus in the New Testament, and we've talked about those. Joseph, Judas, Kepha, Peter, and Jacob or James. Okay, those four. And they're listed. And they've gone through people have gone through all kinds of maneuvers to make it so that they're not full brothers, that they're cousins because of the name of Cleophas, which I show in my book is the real name of the father. Joseph was another calling due to some other things, and Joseph of Arimathea got in there as well. But the fact of the matter is that these were full-blooded brothers. Let me read this to you. If you're at Matthew 125, I want you to hear this, okay? Okay. In Matthew 125, it says this. I'm going to start at 24, okay? Then Joseph, being raised from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord had bidden him, and took unto him his wife, and knew her not till she had brought forth her firstborn son. Remember, I told you about this all. A virgin being hasn't had a firstborn, breaker of the matrix. That's what the real term virgin means. Knew her not till she had brought forth her firstborn son, and he called his name Jesus. You see where I'm going with this? Then Joseph, being raised from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord had bidden him, and took unto him his wife, but he didn't have relations with her until after she had brought forth her firstborn son. It's right in 1 Matthew. It doesn't say he never knew her after the firstborn came. It said he didn't know her prior to, until then. So let's look up the word. You know how I like to do that. Go to your Hebrew, Greek lexicon or Strong's, and you can look up till, T-I-L-L, right? It's word 2193. And it's Hios. And it means until, even until. And there's some others, but basically that's the idea. It doesn't say, and Joseph never knew her, but made sure that she continued in her perpetual virginity. It says that he did not know her till after she had had her firstborn. So I just wanted to let you guys know that. Uh, I won't keep you much longer tonight. Let's see if there's a few. What's the issue here today? Oh, a couple of things, Lori. We've talked about the books that I use. You can go back at the beginning when this is over with. You can see how much material there is to study. And again, Eisenman doesn't throw so much at you to confound you. He throws it at you so that you can do all of the research on your own and you can put the puzzle together on your own. He's already got it there, and then he's just giving you the opportunity to follow the procedure. But it's not complicated to convince you of his position. It's because he's just shown that there's so much material to prove that it's not the way it's been presented to us over the last 2,000 years. And I've talked about a lot of this before, so that's kind of it. I had some interchange with someone on Twitter. You're welcome, Lori. On Twitter today, a particular person wanted to know about, and I'm not going to mention the names, but she found an interview with another guy who came up with some other possibilities. And I'm never going to discount those. I listened to it, and it wouldn't be my position. But I encourage you to look at all the different angles. You don't have to swallow a new idea, hook, line, and sinker, just because it sounds good or because you're interested. That's not what I'm about, okay? I'm trying to convince you that you need to look at the bigger picture. That's all. And sometimes you have to go to these other people, and you'll have to decide whether or not they're worth your time or not, or if their information is worthwhile and trustworthy. So I'm not going to put somebody down with having another idea, but I will mention this because this was kind of important. There is no way that Izatus, the son of Queen Adiabene, was Jesus Christ. Okay, there's no way. I'll just say that. That's what it was kind of about, and there's no way. It doesn't match up in any way, shape, or form. It's a nice story because he was executed, he was crucified, and survived it, as a matter of fact. And Josephus talks about it, but there's nothing else that even comes close to matching the story. And you have to include James in any study of Jesus. You have to, and if you don't do that, you're kind of left out in left field. So that was just something more I thought I'd say about that. So anyway, so that's been the subject matter today. Again, I know some of this is very disturbing, but if you want the truth, if you want to hunger and thirst for righteousness, and if you want to hunger and thirst for the truth, then you have to do these kinds of things. Sandy, is Thomas and Jude the same person? Yes. Yes. Judas, Thomas, Didymus. Judas, Thomas, Hebrew for twin. Didymus, Greek for twin. Yes, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, deplorical. I don't know about the beast standing in the holy place. You know, if you mean I'm not sure what you're talking about there, but we're the ones that are supposed to stand in the holy place. We're the ones that are told, when you see the abomination of desolation, stand ye in the holy place. Well, the holy place means separate, and I explained that probably way last year. Holy just means separate. It doesn't mean piousness. It doesn't mean that you're down on your knees and you don't do anything to offend God. That's not the concept of holy in Hebrew. It was never intended to be that. It means a separation. So when it says you see these things happening in the world, you're to separate from the world. My kingdom is not of this world. That doesn't mean you kill yourself and go to the next dimension, or get translated, or even the rapture. It means you pull yourself out of Babylon, and it says that in Revelation. Come out of her, my people, so you do not partake of her sins. Separate yourselves. Stand in the holy place. Separate yourselves. Okay. All right. Let's see. Who was Enoch? Well, probably a better question is what did Enoch become? He in Hebrew literature, particularly rabbinic Judaism, Enoch becomes the angel Metatron. Okay, that's who that is. But of course, Enoch was he was the guy who was so righteous that God took him straight to heaven, and his family, by the way, and his city that he had. Everybody associated with him, they didn't have to go through the rest of the school here. They were all taken according to other writings and some of the hints in the Old Testament. Can you reprint? No. And there's a reason why I'm not going to deal with Amazon anymore. They really caused me some grief. I'm just not going to deal with them. I could probably go to another publisher, but what I've done is I put it on the web. Um, Roosevelt, who follows me and has done so for a long time, he went the extra mile and started the Crimson Thread website. If you go to the playlist here on my channel and go to the reading of the Crimson Thread, go there, and when you look on the side there, there's the description box, and in there is telling you about what I'm doing, and it gives you the link to the Crimson Thread website that Roosevelt put together that has my manuscript of the book on there for free for you. Okay, you can just open it up and read it there or download it. Uh, it's in a PDF file, so it's free now at this point. I'm not selling the book. I don't want anybody to think that I'm trying to make money off of this. No, I'm trying to expand everybody's understandings of what's going on because what happened in the first century, they're doing it to us again now. As a matter of fact, they never stopped. And then they know that we're going to hide behind that they're going to force us to hide behind our supposed moral high ground and refuse to act. And that's not what happened in the first century. Now, it didn't go very well. The people that stood up against Rome, there were some problems, and I point that out in my book. They thought, and I make a big point about this, they thought that their righteousness alone would win the day. We've seen that in our modern times, and I talk about it all the time. Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, walking in line a mile across an open field against an entrenched, well-armed defense. You know why Pickett did that and why Lee did that? Because God was on their side. Righteousness was going to win the day. They didn't need to worry about tactics. They didn't need to worry about numbers. They didn't need to worry about, thinking out the plan because God was going to be there because they were on the right side. Well, guess what? That's why the Jews had the problem that they did in the first century. They thought that righteousness alone would bring the angelic host down to help them fight their battles. God doesn't work that way. So anyway, I sure get wrapped around the axle, don't I? No, not attacking the mother, Esma. No, as if anything, she's been degraded in essence for 2,000 years. Her true motherhood has been subverted. Her true sacrifices have been ignored. No, it's not attacking the mother. It's bringing her back. It's taking her out of the Romanized history, the Romanized whole deal with the Vestal Virgins and the gods of Dionysus and Mithras and those, Hercules, whatever else. It's taking it from that body, that corpus of material, and putting it back into its Hebraic origins as Isaiah intended it to be. When Isaiah said that he would be born of a virgin, it meant that he would be a firstborn son. That's all it meant. And that's why in my book, The Crimson Thread, there's this argument about the birthright, because that's what it's about. Yeah, set apart is another way to look at being holy. Yeah, that's good. All right. Yeah, I wouldn't call it a rapture wide awake, but yeah, that's kind of what it is. Yeah, Enoch and his city. It happened to Melchizedek too. Does anybody know who Melchizedek likely was? I mean, we don't know for sure, but there's some indications in some ancient writings that Melchizedek, which basically just means righteous king or priest king, but more righteous king, was probably Shem. It was probably Shem, the son of Noah. So anyway, we need to understand the deceit that we've been under for 2,000 years so we can understand what they're doing to us today. Okay? The whole thing, more and more is coming out on this medical procedure. Okay? A lot is coming out now showing how nefarious things are that are going on and the real deal. I mean, why would you give? Well, I can't say too much here because you know why, right? So I got to be careful. But we're seeing those same kinds of things, the deceit. When Jesus was asked what would be the sign of his coming, what was the first thing out of his mouth according to the Gospels? And I know there's some problems with the Gospels. I know that. And I'm very suspicious of Paul and Josephus. Okay? I am, for lots of reasons. But regardless, they'd still use some of his truer words because you can't lie about everything. So what he said is see that you be not deceived. When they asked him what would be the first sign of his coming in those latter times, he said, see that you be not deceived. Deception is the name of the game. It's been happening. It started happening right away, as my book points out, and Eisenman does an excellent job of doing that. Let's see. Thank you, Envy. It's not that I need glasses when I'm reading this. It's that the screen is really hard. Outside, it's really bad, but when I have a light that's facing me, it's hard to see the screen. So it's not really I need my glasses on. But thank you very much for your concern. Okay. Walter is asking, how important is it for the powers that be to know where the bloodline of David is throughout the earth? It's not just David, Walter. It's 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 the bloodline of Joseph of Egypt, particularly through Ephraim, and it's more than just Jesus. If you know anything about my book, there are those of us who are descended from him, and I know there's been a lot of talk about his celibacy, and he had to be celibate because he was making the ultimate sacrifice and all that. I don't mix Pauline Christianity with Jamesian Christianity, and now they'll say, well, but the Essenes did practice celibacy. Yeah, they did it, but not because they didn't want to have kids or didn't like women. They did it because they thought they were going into battle anytime soon. As I pointed out, Leviticus says you can't go into battle if you're married. If you get married, you can't go into battle for a year. And they were constantly thinking that the battle was coming. That was one thing. There was another side to that, but it was a very small group of the Essenes, and this is where James' asceticism was a problem. And I show that divide between him and his older brother, Jesus. Because the royal line has to have progeny. It just does. So, despite the Romanized version of that, and that's what it was, James was a Nazarite. Jesus was a Nazarite, but there were different levels of Nazaritism. A lot of people think that when it says Jesus of Nazareth, it was that he was from Nazareth, and there's all kinds of arguments about that. But the real bottom line is that they were Nazarites. They had taken Nazarite oaths. James took a Nazarite oath for life. Nobody forced him to. He just did it. That didn't make it right. That didn't make it necessary. Jesus took a Nazarite oath, promise is a better word, for a period of time. Okay? However you want to look at that, 40 days in the wilderness, whatever, during some fasting or whatever. He wasn't a perpetual Nazarite in the sense of an ascetic lifestyle all of his life. That's not what happened, because he wouldn't have been executed by Pilate if that were the case. The Romans didn't even kill James. The Herodian priests killed James. Okay? So it's a whole different ball game. But Probably right now is not the time to get into that too deep. Would you characterize Paul as an antichrist? Well, it's interesting that he accuses a lot of other people of that, doesn't he? He calls James, and Peter and John, the chieftest apostles. I'm as good as any of the chieftest of the apostles. Well, really, they walked and talked with Jesus. He didn't. He was allowed by James. He was allowed to go out and preach out in the Gentile world, but he was still told what to say, and he refused to do it. He taught his own brand, I guess you'd say, is what he ended up doing. And he was called on the carpet for it. And because he was, then he calls James and the Jerusalem council the enemy. No, they weren't. They were the ones that walked and talked with Jesus himself. Paul never did that. And Eisenman gets into all this, and I'm going to. Okay, I'm not all of it, because I mean, I am not going to do a book like that. My book was bad enough; it was 450 pages. That was bad enough. I'm not going to do that. But we'll talk about some of those issues. I've already mentioned a few tonight. The possibility of Saul, Paul, and Josephus and Matthew being one and the same. Saul and Paul, Josephus and Matthew. Very possible that there's some collusion going on there, just as an example. And there's historical evidence that strongly suggests those types of things. Okay? Yeah, the book of Peter is an interesting thing. You notice I kind of set you guys up. The other day, I put up a video, and we were talking about the personalities of Jesus, James, John. Jesus, James, Peter, and Judas. We talked about their personalities. And I talked to you about their personalities from the viewpoint of the Gospels. When you look at the Gospels, okay, and you look at the Pauline corpus, you get a particular feeling for these people's personality. And I told you that Peter was kind of like not the sharpest knife in the box, easily persuaded. Remember I told you that? When you get into the pseudo-Clementines, you'll find out that Peter was a very stalwart guy, and he didn't like Paul. Okay? But I needed to give you the basics of what the gospel says and what the Pauline epistles and the Pauline corpus says, so that when you see Peter in these other situations, you'll see that he was nothing like what Paul said he was, or the gospels. Similar, but not like that. Okay? And the point there, when you study, you'll see this, is that he could have been, kind of not quite there. He was, not the youngest brother, but he was certainly one of the younger ones, and he had to grow up. Okay, so he could have done some of the crazy, nutty things earlier on, where he didn't quite put two and two together. But by the time of the 40s, and certainly by the 50s, Peter was a force to be reckoned with, and you'll see that in the pseudo-Clementines. Okay. All right. Oh yeah, it's a lot of reading. Grace Anful, I know. I mean, when I talked about this book here, and I'm telling you, that this, if you study this the way you should, it'll take you a year. And I realize that. But you can't fix 2,000 years of BS and deception in a 50-page explanation. It's just not possible. Look at what I do here. There have been people that, and I don't care, because I'm not on here to make followers. I'm on here to find out those who want to know, who want to get into the meat of the situation. And Unfortunately, because of that, a lot of people, because I am challenging their long held traditions, their long held sacred cows, either drop me completely or just don't check anymore. And I don't care about that. I understand what it's like to try to hold on to something that you firmly want to believe in, even if it isn't true. I've been there. I've been in Catholicism, I've been in Mormonism. You know, I was in Methodism for a while when I was trying to get all of this, trying to understand it when I was very young. So I've been at this for, a long time, since I was real, real small. But, and I said it in my book, they'll, they'll push their faith on us as if it's immutable fact. And when somebody insists on that, it's right then and there that I'm very suspicious of their intentions, even if they're good intentions. What's the old saying? The little saying that people use all the time: the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions. They can have the best of intentions, but if they're trying to get me to, I'm not trying to get you guys to believe a certain way. I'm trying to get you to look at the situation, because I'm telling you it's not the way it's been presented to you. Was Peter crucified upside down? It could have been. Yeah, Peter could have been easily. I'm not certain that happened, but it's very possible. The real question isn't how Peter died, because they did kill him. The real question is who succeeded him, because James was actually the leader of the church, right? Not Peter. Peter just became the Mebeker of Rome. That means the bishop of Rome, basically. James was the Mebeker, the bishop of Jerusalem, who everybody recognized had authority throughout the whole world. But James was stoned to death, and then it would have gone to his successor. And I've kind of hinted about who that successor was. It wasn't Peter, because Peter was martyred in Rome. Then the Mebeker, the bishop of Rome, went to Linus, one of the followers of Peter. And then it went, and I never remember the third one. I think it's Papias, but that's probably not right. And then it goes to Clementine. Okay? But there is no Catholic church at this point in time. The Catholics would disagree with that, because James and then the Jerusalem Council was still in charge. Once the temple was overthrown in Jerusalem, the successor of James, who should have been Peter or Judas, who were then martyred, now who does it go to? Well, I alluded to it the other night. Who was exiled to the island of Patmos? And why was he exiled to the island of Patmos? So he was the successor to James, most likely. No, Clementine's not bad. He's just, he knows Peter, but I don't think he knows James very well. And that wouldn't be surprising. One thing more about Paul, and then I'll go. You'll notice that when Paul went out on his missions, when he went to these different communities, he was teaching a doctrine other than what James authorized him to teach. Why did he do that? Well, and certainly why in the outlying communities. Rome had a problem with the Jewish uprisings. I've already told you that Paul's business was about infiltrating the movement and decapitating it. Okay? So when he went on these Gentile missions, he didn't do it, people are going to hate me for saying this, because he was converted. All right? He did it because his military mission was to neutralize the outlying outposts in case, in other words, I wish I had a board here, but let's say, I use my hand here. Let's say here's Jerusalem, and you have, Ephesus, you have Philadelphia, you have, all these different churches that he went to, the Philippians, the Ephesians, and all that. And they're way far away. They're out, Romans, they're out in the society, they're out in the world. If they support the rebels, the revolutionaries in Jerusalem, what are they if they're out here uncontrolled? They're a threat to the control of Palestine. So they had to be placed in a pacifist situation so that they wouldn't act. Now, it wasn't completely successful. And again, I talked to a lady on Twitter about this today. Izatus, the son of the Queen of Adiabene, joined with the Jews. They're up in, it's basically up northeast of Jerusalem, quite a ways, up in the upper Iraq and Turkish area, up in there. The kingdom of Adiabene and the kingdom of Edessa. And so Paul's efforts weren't always successful because they did join the revolt. But that was the idea. Okay? All right. So it's a military operation. Paul was involved in neutralizing the threat against Rome. That's really what he was about, when you boil it all down to a nutshell. And then we get into the Roman concept of virginity to try to take people's attention off of the royal family and off the line of the Messiah. That's what that was all about. You had the Bar Kokhba, fight later on in 135. Again, the Romans were trying to destroy the royal line or anybody that knew about it. John was exiled to the island of Patmos. So it's not as you've been told. Now, again, does this take away from the mission of Jesus? Not in the least. It brings him back to his Jewish, his Israelite roots, and takes him away from the Roman fairy tales that were to ruin your true understanding of the man and what he did. Okay? All right. And remember, we read it, right? Joseph knew her not until she had her firstborn. Okay. That's all I got for you. I know some of these things are hard and they're scary for those who are looking at them the first time. A lot of you think that, I'm a heretic. No, I'm not. I don't belong to your faith. How can I be a heretic? I don't belong to your faith. Okay? My high priest is Jesus. I don't have anybody else. I don't have a pope. I don't have a preacher. I don't have a reverend. I don't have a pastor. What happened to Jesus' children? He sent them away, except for one. There may have been another couple, but one stayed in Palestine and took over and ended up on the island of Patmos because he was in the royal line. That's my take. I will address that. Maddie, you're saying, so if Paul was no good, that means almost half the New Testament is no good? No, Paul still taught, he couldn't teach too far from the truth because he would have been found out a lot earlier. As it was, he was found out. The thing that he did was he taught not the Messianic movement. He didn't teach the requirements of James, which were no incest, no fornication with foreign nations, no eating no eating meat sacrificed to idols, no drinking or partaking of blood, and basically those things. Paul taught against those, right? The whole situation with Peter that I talked about, it's okay to eat anything. No, that was not the case. Okay? So Paul's idea was to subvert the core beliefs of the Messianic movement so that the people could be corrupted and not become more pacifist so they wouldn't be a problem for Rome. Pay their taxes, for instance. You have to pay your taxes. You have to submit to the Roman authorities. James didn't teach that, not in the least. Okay, so Paul is one of those things that you just got to understand. That's why the history now is more important than the dogma, than the doctrine. You've got to look at what the history is, because where did that doctrine really come from? What was it all about? Um, for instance, I just talked to you about James saying, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, and don't commit fornication. Fornication, again, not necessarily meaning even sex, but in particular types of things: incest, niece marriage, which was a kind of that, promiscuity, okay? Especially when you're going to go into the temple, because you're going to defile it. If you do these impure acts and then go into the temple, you're defiling the temple, you're mocking God. You see how that would work? So Paul says there are those who forbid the eating of meat and forbid marriage. You see how he tweaked that just a little bit? James didn't say you couldn't eat meat even though he was a vegetarian. He said don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, because it's a form of idol worship. It's a form of worship of a false god. It's a pollution to the temple. Okay? So James said don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. If you're going to eat meat, you go out and you take it out and you... As a matter of fact, the word for covenant is actually kurat breit, and it means cut the meat. Here we are with circumcision again. Here we are with cut. You know, they would cut the animals in half and spread them apart, and then the priest would do his thing in the middle. So the covenant was something that they could really see and really partake in. Okay? So anyway, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. Paul changed it to they forbid the eating of meat. And don't commit fornication. Don't do incest. Don't be promiscuous. Don't have sex with your sister and then go to the temple. You know, that's wrong. Paul changes that to James is forbidding to marry. No, that Paul subtly changed things so that he could attack James, and he did it constantly. And if you read, like I said, the Clementines and Herodotus, I think that's the name. I think that's the... Sometimes I get the names mixed up, especially when there's Jewish guys with Greek names. Is that the right one? Anyway, that's not quite right, I think. But at any rate, the concept is still good. James was actually killed because of Paul's influences. So anyway, that's where we are. And it's been over an hour. I probably ought to go. It's getting warm in here. I've only got one light, and I'm surprised it's not making me too discolored. Sometimes it does. Okay, well, that's it for today. Sometimes when I pull too much information in, even I start getting sidetracked. That's not a good thing. So thanks, everybody, for coming. Again, Gloria Young, as I pointed out last time, she was saying that Paul said he saw a light and all that. As I pointed out in one of my past videos here last couple of times, if Jesus told him not to persecute his followers, Paul didn't do a very good job on following through with that, because he persecuted James and the central family. So he didn't do even what he was told to do. And frankly, I don't think he actually had the vision. I don't think he did. Mahalo. Yeah, Suzanne, mahalo. Same to you. Same to you. Okay, I'm going to go. You all have a great night. We'll probably hit some more of this later. Again, I wanted to show you the books. You're talking about getting into some real deep study, but I think it's important. Well, Cynthia, it's right in the Old Testament. In Isaiah, it says, "And when he shall make a sacrifice for sin, he shall see his seed. And who shall declare his generation?" And if you were the Romans and you were controlling the development of the Gospels and the epistles, you would want to downplay his family because you're trying to destroy the royal line. There's one that they missed. Do you know which one it was? There's one that they missed because they didn't think anybody would notice. I'm going to read it to you right now. It's not so much children. Third Epistle of John, verse 1. The elder unto the well-beloved, whoops, sorry, wrong one. Wrong one. Second Epistle of John. The elder, notice he doesn't call himself the great apostle like Paul would, right? He calls himself the elder. The elder unto the elect lady and her children, whom I love in the truth, and not I only, but also all they that have known the truth. Guess who he's talking to there? And why did he write a letter? Why didn't he just go see her? You say that's circumstantial? When you throw in all of the other aspects of this, people are convicted on circumstantial evidence in court. Jesus had a family. Absolutely. 100%. I got to go. Take care, everybody. We'll see you later.